head back up onto the stage, ladies, and open up debate to the floor. Fascinating presentations, some challenging perspectives. There's a very bright light here. Anybody want to ask any questions? If you do, great, you've hands up. Could I ask you if you would like to introduce yourself? That might be helpful.
Hi there. Hi there. My name is Bryce Goodall, and I have got a condition called Asperger's syndrome, a form of autism. So I have a great interest in the psychological bits, but I've actually got a bit of a keen interest in other things. Touching upon the robotics side of the business, I've done a bit of training. I was basically trying to become a trainee ethical hacker.
Ethical hacking.
Ethical hacking, yeah, but looking at different systems.
Yeah.
There's two things. There's three things. Which the one thing is about the aspect of security of information,
yes,
and about that, and security of robotics, and about the security of infrastructure in place.
Yeah.
The second thing is about appointment booking, because we've got an appointments epidemic whereby it's a 3-week waiting list to wait for a doctor to see somebody. That when you're looking at what I mentioned about smartphones, is I think that we should maybe look at the direction of having an, I'm not sure if you guys will agree with me, about having an app-based healthcare.
Yeah, we'll come back to that.
Where we have an app system whereby we can be able to access instant healthcare within an app and also live chat online. And thirdly is about one of my biggest bugbears is getting my blood taken or getting an injection. And when will we ever see having a robot whereby we can get intravenous lines put inside ourselves? Because I'll tell you somebody, when I go to the hospital, I'm bloody terrified about somebody getting my needle up to that. But anyway, thank you in advance for answering my questions, and have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and three very good points, I think, to kick us off. The first one was about data security. I mean, you were talking about people's fear of our information, our records. You know, can we ever have a system that's totally safe? I mean, at the moment, you see records on paper being pushed around hospitals. Do you want to respond to any of that? Do you think? Because there was, we'll come on to robotics in a second. Yeah.
So a lot of the NHS does technically have banking level security, but the point is that those systems don't link up. They're secure in slightly different ways. So it's actually the interoperability challenge between these systems, which is where there are some really big potential holes from a security perspective. I think we were talking earlier that it's often interesting to compare what we currently have with the future risk. So this being the risk of a paper record versus your digital record. So at present, a lot of us have paper records. And I remember having a huge fight with my GP saying, I want my health record emailed to me. She said, we can't email it to you because of patient confidentiality. I said, yeah, I'm the patient. Can I please have it in an email form? She said, no, but we can print it off for you. I said, well, what if I leave it on the bus? And she was like, well, that's your problem. I said, well, what if it gets, if my email gets hacked, that's my problem. So I think that it's very easy to say, oh, but if we do this, what are the risks? How about the risks of not doing anything right now? Data security is increasingly growing as a priority in that respect.
Margaret, you want to
Can I support that point? But can also say that going back to the apps point and also about data storage, etc. So one of the big challenges around the NHS just now is actually there's millions of apps, and there's been various attempts to curate reliable apps. And some of these apps are also, developed by companies who it's a very fast-moving environment. The NHS finds it very hard to kind of curate what's going to be reliable. They've not managed to do that just now. And I think the other point, just supporting the point that was made, is all our data just now is all highly centralised. Once you start opening it up to all the channels you've talked about, the NHS, the centralised system is going to find it really, really hard to cope with all the data that's going to come in. So we need another different form of holding data and people holding their own data and all that stuff, because actually the NHS is never going to be able to keep up with all that.
Yeah, there's an argument that we could hold our own data and we could decide who gets access to it. that nurse, that care worker, because we're talking integrated health
Yeah.
and social care, although we're talking very much about the NHS here, it doesn't stand alone. And at the moment, there are so many different systems and people can't access them. I mean, Debbie, I've spoken to very many nurses who are working in the community. They're working blind because they can't get access to patient records. There's something really wrong there, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think the NHS is such a huge organisation and there's so many different facets to it, and it's getting all the different, kind of people to speak to each other or to communicate with each other. It's a massive task.
Yes.
Yeah.
But some bits of the NHS, though, not digitised necessarily, we do have people holding their own records, like maternity records.
Yeah.
And in some countries, like Italy,
Yeah.
people hold their own health
Yeah.
records. They don't have an internet.
Estonia has
Yeah.
got a fantastic system,
So
for
actually,
instance.
it wouldn't be difficult to digitise something you held
No.
for yourself.
But you talked about risk aversion, Margaret, when you talked do you think that applies? Because I think people are frightened to start the debate with us as citizens about our information. I don't know, does anybody in the audience have any views about this? Do you think, would you have worries about, being handed your own health record, right? You hold it, you can access it, read anything that's in it. I wanted to know, for instance, holiday vaccinations. I wanted to know what I'd had. I had to wait weeks and weeks and weeks to get an appointment with a practice nurse to tell me, and I'd have loved to have been able to go and look that up. Yeah?
I mean, on the risk aversion point, I'm not sure it's so much about people's attitude, public's attitude towards things like data, but, the staff within the NHS and openness to innovate, because, it's quite fair that people are risk averse. I'm not very keen on a surgeon saying, I'm just going to be quite creative today, let's try and lob another bit off. That's not really how healthcare works. I think it's quite good to be slightly risk averse. I think the difficulty and the challenge here is that we only innovate by making small incremental changes or massive disruption. And so how can you provide a system that is safe enough that you have flexibility to innovate around the edges, but not at the detriment of someone's life?
But yet, then again, real bravery behind, Debbie, for instance, the robotic system that you describe. Does it exist anywhere else, or is it only Aberdeen that people with prostate cancer can get this fantastic service?
So Aberdeen was the first, but there is now in Edinburgh and in Glasgow as well. Yeah.
Is it called the Da Vinci system you're using?
Yeah, that's right. That's the one that we
Okay,
use.
great.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
But the thing is, when we got our robot, it was really interesting that England had 44 robots doing
Whoa.
robotic surgery, but we didn't have any in Scotland at all.
Now, why? Because
Yeah.
we like to think of ourselves as leading the game, don't we? Certainly when it comes to healthcare.
Yeah, I think probably initially in England they were privately funded, but then the NHS started coming on board. And I think the thing in Scotland was that the Scottish Government, and it's true, we didn't have any long-term data, to kind of prove the benefits of robotic surgery.
And yet, you're seeing it for real. Now, before I go to take another contribution from the floor, just to pick up the point that our first questioner made about, is there potential for this robotics to be expanded, say, to blood testing? Let's take that as an example. Do you think that we should be doing more of this?
We can do blood testing. There's the technology to do blood testing at home in your own home is there. It just hasn't been rolled out.
Yeah.
So they are, absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
Can I just add one point? Even, I was even watching, was at San Quentin Prison.
Will you put the microphone? Thank you. Will you make it short and I can get...
Basically, I was looking at just recently, quite interesting, I was looking at the death penalty.
Yeah.
And because of the drugs epidemic over there to try and get ascertained drugs for the death penalty, and the inexperienced operators who do that, there is actually now technology which now think the San Quentin prison have now introduced called using specialist vein finder technology.
So it exists.
So basically, all we do is you put the machine there, and they put a wee light system, and after we can then find the vein. And automatically it will guide that person to that vein. And I'm surprised there's not that technology available for phlebotomists.
Thank you.
But
Margaret.
I think the point that was being made was that in some places, there are some places in the world, like Victoria State in Australia, where actually They've taken all of these technologies and for the last 20 years have consistently, as a system, worked more and more and more to get more and more acute and emergency and other specialist services at home, using all the technologies that exist.
I mean,
And
national
hospitals
clinical
get smaller.
strategy
Yeah.
we should be doing here.
Yeah.
We'll come back to why we aren't. I'm going to take another contribution from the floor.
Just when you asked about how you would feel about having your own personal health records, I'm Patrick, studying immunology. People we still have lots of hypochondria in the world from people coughing and looking up their symptoms online. Do you not think that giving them their personal data, their health records would just totally blow that out of proportion?
Well, the worried well would become
you
more
Google all
worried
your
and less
symptoms.
well.
Yeah, you Google your symptoms. And
Okay, so that's quite an interesting take on it then. So if you trusted people with their own health records, wouldn't it just all go a little bit Pete Tong, Maxine?
So healthcare is a very interesting market in the sense that it defies any kind of normal market. And there's a huge amount of, sort of supply and induced demand that happens in healthcare. Yeah. So if you give people more information, often it actually costs more because they engage in the system more. And as a result, with the opportunity across the system means that as a system, fewer people get well because of the opportunity cost. But you can see that with a health data literacy perspective. So NHS Digital did a study and said that the amount of time it would take to take an average person on the street to get them educated enough in health data literacy so they are no longer worried was 2 weeks of intense classroom teaching. And so they said, well, that's not feasible, so we're just not going to do it. Mm. That's not an appropriate response. We've got to find new ways, and I mean, you'll be very kind of aware of this, new ways of communicating the benefits and the importance of health data. Because at the moment, it's too scary to people saying, we're not going there.
And I think the opposite's also true. So there's the worried well at one end of the spectrum, and you've got the people with the multiple long-term conditions at the other who are getting huge amounts of interventions, who don't really understand what's, they've got nobody running the path for them, helping to coordinate anything. Nobody asking the question about, you're not going to be cured, but what will make the best out of your life? What can we do? We can do lots of things, but what are the one or two things that can really help?
So you've got to give people the information to allow them to take control. I mean, Debbie, you must see this, with patients that you're working with. Do they want information? Do they want to be able to manage their condition perhaps better?
Yeah, I think most patients definitely do now. And I think, from when I started out in nursing 30 years ago, healthcare has changed enormously. And I think, the kind of days of the surgeon or the doctor telling you what to do and not really engaging with the patient, finding out what the patient wants, have gone. I mean, I think, we're much more interactive now, asking patients, kind of their views on what they want as a treatment.
I loved that about the feedback that you actively solicit in your service.
And I think the other interesting thing in that is, when does a person become a patient?
Okay, expand on that a little.
Well, I think, by calling somebody a patient, you put them in a position where they're in a dependent relationship with you. So why wouldn't you call, why do we make a differentiation between people that are in services, calling them patients, when actually the rest of us are people?
Yeah. Can I ask, who here has actually seen their personal health record? Oh my gosh, it's staggering. So that's quite a personal bit of information that is about you. I spend my life trawling through medical records, and the amount of mistakes that are in that at population level is staggering. So imagine what could be the mistakes about your own information in your own record.
Is it, are we touching on power? To hold this information and deny people access to it is surely holding power. Yep. And it has sat with professionals, principally doctors, because general practice, for instance, 90% of healthcare right now happens in the community at general practice level. I know we're talking about hospitals here, but, is there an issue there, professional power and ceding that power being part of the culture change we need to see?
Yeah, I think people, in healthcare are sometimes resistant to change. In Aberdeen, we went paperless recently, so any consultations we have with patients just go directly onto our computer system. But oh my goodness, some of the consultants, some of the medical staff were having a meltdown because there's not actually physically a piece of paper now in, medical notes. But the thing is, we can now access this all on the computer, and our computer systems are getting much better at talking to each other now as well. So it is getting easier, I think, you know, kind of. But I mean, our technology in the NHS and, you know, in Grampian, we've just recently got Windows 10.
Yes.
And we were like, this is a breakthrough, do you know what I mean? Because we're miles behind everywhere else. We don't have tablets. We've got, you know, kind of.
I mean, don't you think in this day and age, well, I don't know about you, but I live by my smartphone and, you know, mobile technology. I wouldn't be without it. And yet our health system is denied it. Does that shock you as much as it shocks me? Okay, we'll bring you a microphone. It's coming your way.
I was a bit shocked to discover, I go to Western General here in Edinburgh for checkups every 6 months, and to my great surprise, I discovered that the communication between the Western General and my GP is not done by computer, it's done by the postman.
Yeah.
If there's anything to report,
Which is regarded as more secure for some reason.
It's just that computers can't speak to each other, apparently.
Yeah.
Now, that's within Edinburgh.
Yeah.
And I think that, I mean, you're talking about my medical history and notes and so on. Some will be the Western General, some I think might be Edinburgh, some will be the GP, but I wouldn't bet that all of it was
Let's
Edinburgh.
go back to your point.
And you don't know where it is.
No. I'd like to ask another question. If
Go
I may.
ahead.
Sorry. About 30 years ago, which is a long time ago.
I
things have
remember
moved
it
on.
well.
I read an article in the Guardian newspaper, and it was a passionate advocacy of centres of excellence. And
Yes.
it said patients should go. It was about bowel cancer, I think.
Yes.
And what it said was patients should, and it listed the ones, it was about England, Wales. It listed the ones in England, Wales that were very, very good.
Yeah.
And now dealing with bowel cancer.
Yeah.
And what it said, it listed the sort of outcomes, and they were much better in a place where the surgeon just did bowel cancer operations. And not only that, but the radiographers and so on, the nurses and so on, were all geared up to that specific thing.
Yeah.
Now that, it occurs to me in Scotland, that is not being done.
Now, it was set out in that care report that I mentioned of 2004.
4-5, I think.
Yeah, 2004-5. That basically said we needed a system in Scotland where for the highest tech things, there would be very few specialist centres, and then you would go down through, you know, to kind of generalism, which could be delivered and has to be delivered locally. It hasn't happened.
The National Clinical Strategy says exactly the same thing.
The new National Clinical Strategy
says much the same thing.
which was published, what, a year ago?
A year ago, yeah.
Yeah.
So we're
Says
still
exactly
working-
the same thing.
So we're still working
So
on it.
why isn't it happening, Margaret Duffy?
I think there's been a lot of debate. I mean, so that model was based on a view, or not complete evidence that said the more that you do of something, the better the outcomes are. There's a
It's
lot.
logical.
There's a lot of professional debate about where that dividing line lies, and people.
Is that about vested interest?
That's
And
about, yes, it is.
it's
about,
vested interest
yeah, it's
that
about-
could stand in the way of the very best healthcare being offered to people across this country.
And we can't seem to be in a position where we can be definitive. So somebody says you need to do X number of procedures to make that centre viable. Another centre says, well, actually, how do we've got contrary discussion and debate, so we don't
But
have
you
a
can
definitive.
carry on arguing about that forever, or you can just do it, Debbie, can't you?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, certainly now, in Aberdeen, all our patients come to us, obviously, but we've also got patients from Highland regions, so that kind of incorporates the kind of Outer Hebrides, kind of the west coast of Scotland, and also Tayside are supposedly, coming on board. So that would then be, like, Aberdeen would be a sort of centre of excellence for, robotic urology.
But it's not explicit, which I find quite interesting, and we'll come to why that might be.
And I think the key to that, though, is where it works. It's where there's really, really excellent clinical leadership who want to make it happen, who persuade other colleagues it's the right thing to do.
So the vested interest doesn't win the argument
by
carrying on arguing.
Yeah.
You wanted to come in, Maxine?
Yeah, on your point about the lack of clinical system integration, I mean, it's a super boring topic. Interoperability is not what gets me out of bed in the morning. But it's the fact that, about 20 years ago, there was quite lazy procurement. So I'm not sure if you know how this works, apologies if you do, but how systems get into the NHS is that you as a technology provider will say we can provide this electronic medical record, and then it'll then get procured, and then it'll be rolled out across a region. Now, when that happened, that was very basic for form procurement. Procurement is one of the worst, most complicated systems ever. But when those systems were procured, it was not really a requirement that they had to talk to other systems, because their approach was slightly divide and conquer. And it's only now that reverse engineering, fire APIs, so the systems have to talk to each other. But it's quite difficult to reverse engineer open systems now, and that's a difficulty.
I mean, one of the things that I hear people saying, oh, it's too expensive to introduce, to like front-end invest in joining up these systems, creating systems that can talk to one another, that we could access on apps, that we could hold our own records. Surely it's far more expensive not to do that and to keep old systems not talking to each other and running.
Well,
no?
Who's here?
We're going to bring you a microphone. Let me bring you a microphone, sorry. Only because that people can hear you then, and you're recorded.
Well, modernising IT systems has been a disaster from a healthcare perspective, precisely for the reasons that you've said. Trying to reverse engineer has proved absolutely impossible. So you've had the actual suppliers being withdrawn because the cost was actually becoming so prohibitively expensive. So it's partly through the lack of the ability to reverse engineer something. So I'm not quite sure how there is a solution, but actually what was going to happen would have been disastrous financially, and actually you wouldn't have ended up with the answer the way that the initial consultants were trying to do it, sadly.
Well, we had this thing called care.data. Is anyone familiar with care.data?
It was south of the border, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Specifically.
So
although we've had our own up here.
Sorry, I haven't got a Scottish example. So care.data was basically an attempt to say, okay, we've got all these different data systems, we're going to pull them into one pool and seriously think about population health management. I mean, this is the dream. But then what happened? So it was actually, going on the leadership point, it was basically a battle of egos at the highest level of NHS England. And they didn't inform the public as to why we were pooling everyone's health systems into one pool. And what happened? It was a complete PR disaster. Everyone's like, oh God, you're pulling our data to sell it to the big corporates, we're all screwed. And the whole thing was pulled. And that set the UK back decades in population health management.
So it's leadership. Because if banks can do, if I bank online, do you? I don't know, do you in the audience?
Your app's your bank manager. Your app's your bank manager.
Yeah, I mean, if banks can do it, and Apple can do it, and Sky can do it, why can't the NHS do it, and health and care?
Huge upfront cost. I mean, it's a huge cost.
But surely the cost of not doing it is also vast.
There's a huge opportunity cost, but trying to find the money up front when money is constrained is one of the issues, and having leadership who are not fluent in the possibilities around all of this.
Have you not thought about just putting in frameworks, for example, like solar panels on top of your brand new hospitals and stuff like that, and generating passive income through that? And after that, then the income streams which you're getting from like selling your waste on and stuff like that, you could actually be able to generate that residual income, and after that then use for front-end costs.
Can we hand the microphone back to this guy in the middle here? Thank you. I'm going to bring it. Yeah, well, good. That's fine. Feel free.
No, it was one of the earlier panels today, was talking about the redesign of Edinburgh Hospital, and actually how the original wards had been very separate. But
you're talking about the
Nightingale
new
system, and then the new one, one of the professors said that they got the first case of MRSA within a week. Under the old system, it didn't. So I was going to ask about the hospitals of the future in terms of design. How everything had become so compacted that you got an unintended consequence of actually modernising things on a new site that actually had increased the threat of MRSA.
I find it very strange, because the old Royal Infirmary had very Victorian
nooks and crannies. Did he evidence it?
Yeah. Yes, he worked there.
So but did he evidence it?
I know much more about the Larbert Hospital, where the bed spaces and all that stuff, the materials, everything was designed to absolutely minimise hospital-acquired infection. But it seems to me something to be contested, that you would get worse infection in the brand new Royal Infirmary than you would have in your Victorian.
Maybe it's about intensity of bed use. Maybe it's about
a different way in, a route in.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, on the design point, there's some really interesting work happening with actually NHS Digital, again, brought together an amazing group of predominantly mathematicians and designers and said how you would design a hospital. So mathematicians were designing flow of patients with water, and designers were saying, like, let's completely redo the experience. And clinicians were only allowed to give input to clarify clinical pathways. And they created the most baffling, most efficient hospital. But the point is that it's these crazy, out of the clinical environment groups that are coming up with these interesting ideas of how we can rethink and redesign hospitals.
But there's a fundamental question, isn't there, as well? We know that hospitals are dangerous places to be. It is where people go when they are very sick and infections spread there.
I mean, it's like hell.
So why are we putting so many people in hospitals when actually it's very possibly safer to treat people at home?
Of course it is.
We're funneling people still through the same front doors. It's kind of nonsensical, no?
Well, yes and no. It goes back to the prediction point. You know, you go to your doctor when you're ill, and you don't know before you're ill because we don't have that
But then you can't
information.
get out of hospital because the services aren't there to get you home, so you end up with delayed discharges and, you know, for instance, elderly people who get very disoriented in hospital. It's a really bad place for people to be unless they have to be there.
And I think the other so the kind of work, the things that Maxine was talking about in terms of prediction and to use technology to help with prediction. I think the other thing which needs to be rethought is the whole social care kind of regime where, you know, the 4 times a day.
And resourcing that.
And because I think the other really quite compelling piece of research is that for over 65s, loneliness and isolation has as much impact on your health as 15 cigarettes a day. So all the technology we have needs to be about enabling people to do the things they need to do, but in a social setting and being part of their community. But that isn't the same as being in your house, being visited by social workers.
It's about rethinking. I'm going to take another contribution from the floor here. And if anybody else wants to join in, catch my eye.
Hi, I was wondering, in terms of collecting data for personalised medicine, in a situation, for example, where someone was applying for something like life insurance, how would you be able to avoid prejudice from commercial companies offering things like insurance if they know that someone is more likely to get ill than another person?
Oh, okay.
Very good question. Very good question. So it's a problem that hasn't quite hit the UK yet, but if we look at that from an American model, you know, they are really in the thick of it at the moment because they have, technically we have a very large health insurance system. It just happens to be national. Obviously in America they don't. So there are generally public schemes to protect those most vulnerable in society. So quite an interesting model in Holland is that everyone pays to the equivalent of the Treasury. The Treasury then pays the equivalent to the Department of Health. And the Department of Health then works out how expensive you're going to be as a patient. So if you are an 85-year-old female with dementia, you're going to cost the health system a lot more than if you're a 25-year-old man. And so they weight how much money they give to different health insurers. And so they protect those people so that health insurers cannot negatively select against people who are going to be more expensive. Now, the thing about health insurance is the more data you have, the more accurate data you have on people, the lower premiums are. So actually, premiums rise and rise and rise. People gain, people hide information. In an ideal world, all insurers would know absolutely everything about you and your health, because that's the way you make premiums as low as possible, because then your risk pool is the most efficient possible. Okay, so that's quite esoteric, because actually, you can game it. But in an ideal world, every health insurer should know absolutely all about you, because that's what makes it cheaper for everyone.
How would you feel about that? How do you feel about that as the person that asked that question? Can I?
I'm not sure, really.
It's all very challenging.
But so genetics, I think, is a better example. So there are actually some schemes in the UK that prevent health insurers from using your genetic information. Because have any of you done 23andMe or Decode Me?
No.
The lonely hand at the end. Well done, you. So that's where you spit in a vial, you send it off to San Diego. They come back and say, here are your risk predictors for these diseases. If that was able to be picked up by a health insurance company, that's quite risky. We have schemes in the UK that prevent health insurers from using that information, but we don't know how long that's going to be the case.
It's interesting though, isn't it? Because, I mean, for instance, there are other internet search engines, but Google if you've ever tried to look for anything, I look for a bin composter for my garden. And everywhere I look now, the messages are coming up with bin composting for your garden. You know, it's not too long away before we get, surely, you know, individual profiles. If you're searching health information, somebody's holding that, as you said, Maxine, yeah? We're going to take a contribution here, and I know the gentleman at the back's got his hand up again, but yeah.
Just something related to that last point. One other aspect of insurance is sort of like travel insurance and getting medical cover. And it was just to pick up on that if you do have something extremely rare, there can be very little actuarial data that they can then base a quotation on. And it can be quite a struggle. I mean, you then have to declare more and more to the company and try and group yourself.
Yeah.
But it's...
But what Maxine's saying, basically, the more information there is...
Well, it's 2 points. The public schemes need to be in place to protect those most at risk in society. So people who have rare diseases, you know, a plethora of chronic diseases, you need that public... I think you need that public combination in order to protect those groups.
Which we already do to an extent, don't we, in terms of health provision. We don't discriminate against people with expensive cancers, for instance, or people who live in lower socioeconomic neighbourhoods who are going to be more costly to the health service. It's very interesting. Now, anybody else got... The guy at the back had his hand up. Do you want to come in again?
Yeah, first of all, I love the idea of information. Like, I'd love to have an app that told me absolutely everything about me at every second of the day, because the more information you have, the more you can do about it. But
Fitbit.
yeah. But where do you draw the line with, like, illness? So how do you know when someone... You can have all the information about them, but when is someone infected by a disease, or when is someone actually sick, and when do you send them to the hospital? You know, you could be 1 point under or 1 point over and miss out on treatment, or get treatment when you didn't need it.
I mean, I don't know, Debbie, for instance, I mean, in your field, it's very clear, isn't it? That
yeah, it's usually fairly cut and dried. So people have always had diagnostic tests. They've gone with symptoms to the GP. They've had diagnostic tests done. And then that's when they come through.
But I suppose do they get in fast enough? You know, we have got issues, haven't we, with people presenting too late with cancer.
Especially with our prostate guys. I mean, most GPs are pretty good, I have to say.
Yeah.
We have a blood test for prostate cancer that we use.
Yeah.
And I have to say...
But there's still an individual decision to be made, isn't there? That these signs and symptoms are something that you would go to the doctor with quickly or not.
And I think that there's a really interesting strand of policy called realistic medicine.
Yes.
And that's about kind of, and partly that's about as technology gets more and more kind of able to detect things earlier and earlier, there's an issue then about what do you do about things that historically we might not have done something about. So there was a very interesting programme on the radio just recently about thyroid cancer. So historically, thyroid cancer was diagnosed because you got a lump in your neck. And now, but referrals into the thyroid cancer service has gone up by about 50% in the last 4 years. And that's because now diagnostic tests for other things are actually getting more sophisticated and are starting to reveal things about your thyroid. And so they're getting more referrals into from the public. And actually the parallel strand is there's been a post-mortem study in New Zealand for about the last 100 years, and they've discovered that a lot of people die with thyroid cancer, but it's never caused them any
prostate.
Absolutely, I was just going to say that. Yeah.
And then, but actually, there's now a big debate about the support groups for people with thyroid cancer about, you know, because you know you've got it, actually being told it might not impair your health actually makes you feel you've got something that's not as important as other people, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. It's really important. It's a really interesting debate.
It really is.
Because it's also what markers you're using to measure your health. So my research is about can we capture dementia and predict dementia far beyond you actually get symptoms. So by the time you actually have symptoms of memory loss, you're about 77% neuronal loss. And so your neurodegenerative processes far precede your actual symptoms of dementia.
Yeah.
But if you're told 20 years before you actually get dementia, by the way, you're on the pathway to dementia, we have no cure. There are some huge ethical issues with that. So I think it's a very interesting question.
I mean, we had the same issues arose with HIV treatments and everything that we've been talking about, really. How do you handle that discussion with patients? Because realistic medicine, for those... I don't know, has everybody heard of realistic medicine? Scotland's been pioneering, really, in pushing this Our chief medical officer, a woman called Catherine Calderwood, is promoting realistic medicine, which, as I understood it, was also about having conversations with patients rather than making an assumption that they would want to be treated. You know, it's about end-of-life conversations as well, isn't it? And, you know, do you really want this investigation?
Yeah, so we do that with our prostate cancer patients when we first kind of meet them. You know, because we have people who are diagnosed with prostate cancer whose disease may not ever cause them any problems. However, they've had a test, they've been diagnosed, and they've got to live with that diagnosis of prostate cancer, but it's actually giving them treatment, actually going to be of benefit to them in the long run. However, if you've told somebody they've got cancer, it's really difficult to, it's not that we don't do anything about it, because we'll always keep a really close eye on them, but people still have that kind of thinking that surgery, that will remove the, you know, the kind of problem.
Do people ever decline and say, well, actually, do you know what? I think I'll wait and see.
Oh, yeah.
Do they?
Yeah, I think,
really
and that's the thing about
interesting.
prostate cancer, there's a lot of guys that are actually very educated about prostate cancer.
Yes.
There's a lot of talk about it. So, yeah, no, guys do that.
And,
so
and the downside of surgery versus the upside of doing nothing, I think, is
Yeah.
actually is part of the same realistic medicine conversation.
Anybody else? Yeah, we've got a hand up here. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Sorry.
Thank you for...
Just from the prostate cancer point of view, we've brought in a whole new realm of management, which is actually active surveillance for prostate cancer. So we've now realized that there's been a massive over-treatment, even with fantastic technology. And instead of that, what we do is we now actively manage them by just keeping an eye on it.
However, some men do not like that.
Yeah.
You know, and it's patient choice at the end of the day. So you'll have guys who we recommend this active surveillance treatment to, and they'll be like, do you know, some people are, you know, kind of worried about their health, and worrying about their health can be detrimental to their health. So, you know, we have had guys who cannot live with active surveillance.
Yeah, fascinating. Anybody else? Yes, we've got a hand up in the middle of the room. Thank you.
I think often the press is very negative about the NHS, that there's not enough money. Do you think that there's positive futures and there's positive things, and we can actually make things better with the limited funds that we've got?
Okay.
What a nice question
to
basically end on.
Well, no, not quite end on it. We've got 10 more minutes.
so there's been I happen to this, there's been a 720% increase in the number of negative headlines on the NHS in the past 2 years.
Are you talking about south of the border, though? Yeah,
sorry.
Because, I mean, I think we have to draw a distinction here, don't we? Or do we? Anyway.
We're all one, guys.
Feel free to heckle.
I think there are a lot of, you know, there's a lot of good points about the NHS, but often they're not the interesting stories. Do you know what I mean? So us getting our robot, I mean, that was great, you know, we're running the papers and stuff, that was a good story, but they are few and far between often, you know, unfortunately it is often the negative side of things.
And surely it's important to scrutinise, to hold to account. Do you agree? To analyse, to ask the questions, to say what value for money are we getting, what's happening out there. Yeah, Margaret?
I also think, go back to my point about the key issue in all of this is about long-term conditions and how we manage those differently. We've got a very curative model in the NHS, so we treat things like they're always going to be cured, but actually you know, we need a different conversation, which is about actually people don't want lots of hospital visits and pills and all that. They want something that will help to make the best of their lives.
A lot of people living with multiple conditions that they will live with all their lives. We've got one person here and one person here.
Thanks. I just wanted to come back on your point of we do want scrutiny of the NHS, don't we? And I think it's sort of the obvious answer to that is yes, and of course I do. But I think there is an interesting question about when does scrutiny just become endless chasing of negative stories that's actually eroding public confidence in a key service and becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy? And I think there is a really important debate to be had around that. I think
there is. And I think it's a slightly separate debate from the one we're having here, but I agree with you, there's a really important debate to be had, and I'd like to see it backed up with some evidence, you know, looking at where stories are coming from and how they're generated. But can I perhaps come down here, but maybe we put that on the Science Festival agenda for another time.
I was disappointed to hear, it sounds like anyway the last strategy was not implemented because of vested interests, as you mentioned. And I'm just wondering how long can vested interests stop the benefits to the service users? And I'm wondering what solutions can change this. I'm thinking myself of the financial services industry. And what happened there was the regulator came in, he basically said your pensions, default fund will be 75 bips. It's the customer that matters. You better make sure your communications are clear. Is this the sort of thing we need in the health sector?
As ever, I think with the health sector, there's lots and lots of different vested interests, isn't there? It's not one.
And I'm sorry if I gave the impression that nothing has happened to implement the care report and that the national clinical strategy is just reiterating it. Actually, there's been some really, really important changes that have been made. Some of the things that Debbie was talking about, some of the really important conversations at professional level about, actually where is the best place for people to go, and a recognition it isn't all just about doctors, it's about the whole team and their ability to support things. But where things remain a bit intractable, and we have got services in Scotland that we have been talking a long time about in terms of actually benefits of centres of excellence versus the rest, I think it comes down to real clinical leadership.
And political leadership,
and
perhaps,
political leadership as well.
We haven't mentioned the P word yet.
But I think the politicians find it hard if clinical people can win an argument. Yeah. Clinical people can help to position something that potentially is quite contentious in a way that makes it not. And we've got some really good examples in Scotland, like the cancer networks, like some of the things that have happened around cardiology. Some of the things that have happened in the north in terms of, I think there's some really important things that have happened. If clinical people make it difficult, politicians will really find it difficult.
Yes,
it's hard to stand up against patient safety being waived as a card. So the clinical people, supported by sensible management, and helping to have the debate in a very measured, sensible way that. But then you got people that are not prepared to do that.
Yeah,
and it's
and
what
you get
do
other
about
people
that.
who stand up and, well, in the media we call them shroud wavers. People will die if you do this, and that becomes the front page of your local newspaper.
Yeah.
But it goes back to the accountability point. So if we move away from hospitals, move to the pharmaceutical industry, notorious for gaming, fudging outcomes, statistical fudging left, right and centre. And every time there's a drug launch, there is a actual human being who is personally responsible for major adverse effects that could have been prevented for that drug launch. And that's putting personal accountability and therefore a potential criminal repercussion like has now happened in banking.
Yeah.
And I think that accountability is quite a good pusher.
That's quite an interesting one. Debbie, do you see this? I mean, you see, reluctance to I don't mean innovate, but to develop in the way that perhaps we need to develop in the time frames in which we need to do it in.
Yeah, I think it's difficult, and you get sometimes you are blinkered to the way you work, the way that things are in the NHS, and it's just the way that it's always been done. And it is difficult sometimes. It is good when people from outside come and see, what you're doing, and can give their opinion, because you are sometimes very blinkered.
Because then, people do take to the barricades. We've seen this before, haven't we? We saw this when they were trying to implement the care report recommendations in parts of Scotland. Yep. We could have all sorts of conversations about whether that was done badly or not, but we all as citizens have a part to play in it as well.
Yeah, and I think the thing is that sometimes healthcare professionals think they're doing a good job, but what they think they're doing is not always for the benefit of the patients, which is why it's good to get feedback from them.
So there's a different national conversation, forgive me for that phrase, but we're going to take one more contribution from the floor. At the back of the room, right at the back of the room. Thank you.
Hi there. I'm a nursing student, and my entire last year study has actually been based on failings of the NHS and things like Morecambe Bay, Francis Report, Leaven Report. And I just wanted to ask the panel what their thoughts were on, if we've been talking about leadership and accountability tonight so far, where do they stand on how human error initially affects patient safety and patient care?
Okay, thank you. I'd like to go to Debbie with that one first, if I may. Human error, how much a nursing student who's talking about, being very conscious of things like the Francis Report into the North Staffordshire incidents and everything that can be learnt from that. And when things go badly wrong, it comes down, that Francis Report was excoriating reading. Leadership, accountability, human error and learning from it?
For sort of within a culture change within the NHS, if we're supposed to now be adopting a culture of honesty and candour within our staff force, what are your thoughts on blame culture? Because as far as I'm aware, blame culture is still the exact same as it was.
Okay, very briefly, because literally we've got 2 minutes left, and I'm sorry to drop this question on you, but it's been posed.
Yeah, well, I think as a nurse who's, you know, kind of obviously working in the NHS, the culture has changed, I think, you know, and, you know, obviously not just on the back of the Francis report, but over the 30 years I've been a nurse, the culture has certainly changed.
In terms of encouraging, if you see
people to
something
speak out,
wrong,
and if you see something that's wrong, you know, kind of speaking out against that, and I think, you know, the kind of ballpark has changed, and, you know, kind of,
And to pick up the human error element of this, do you think the move towards more use of robotics is going to minimise human error?
Yeah, it should do, absolutely. I know, you know, from doing even things like drug rounds and wards, you know, humans aren't infallible, and the NHS has tried lots of different strategies to try and reduce drug errors. But unfortunately, we're human beings at the end of the day. I can be doing a drug round, but get, you know, 10 interruptions during that drug round, you know.
Can you make it very brief, because we've literally got 30 seconds left.
And I think that one really important programme that happened in the NHS and is still happening is the Scottish Patient Safety Programme, which actually changed the whole culture, put nurses at the forefront, visible kind of accountability around a whole range of important things. I think
Scottish Patient Safety Programme has made huge developments and inroads. But again, you know, do you think data's got something, a role to play here?
Yeah, I was actually going to finish on a female note. You know, the upper echelons of NHS are often described as an old boys club, which is macho. I quote this from people who come to Health Tech Women, and I think the future is working much more collaboratively, and lots of people say if we had better gender balance, if we had better inclusion at the senior level, it would be better.
So more women at the top. On that note, can I thank our panel and very much all of you for really driving this discussion on. Thank you so much.